somebody who is a Hall of Famer, when their opinions are rooted in logic, then their opinion holds a little bit more weight than the average Tom, Dick, and Harry walking down the street. But when you're a Hall of Famer, and I hear your logic, and I think to myself, oh, she's just dumb. She was good at basketball, but she's just dumb. D-U-M-B. Dumb. Yeah, I don't need to take her opinion seriously.
The basketball world doesn't just witness disagreements. It witnesses full-blown media earthquakes when Sheryl Swoopes gets mentioned alongside Caitlin Clark. And this time the shockwave hits harder than ever. The words aimed at Sheryl Swoopes don't land like criticism. They land like a public dismantling of credibility, where every opinion tied to Caitlin Clark becomes part of a larger battle over truth, legacy, and influence. In this moment, Sheryl Swoopes is no longer just a Hall of Fame name from WNBA history. She becomes the center of a modern media storm fueled by Caitlin Clark's rise and the polarized narratives surrounding her impact on the Indiana Fever. Every sentence directed at Sheryl Swoopes turns into a debate about whether criticism of Caitlin Clark is analysis or agenda. The tone escalates fast. Caitlin Clark becomes the gravitational force of the entire argument, with Sheryl Swoopes positioned as someone whose statements about her are now being questioned in real time. The language becomes sharper, more personal, and more divisive, pulling Elle Duncan into the center of the storm as she reacts to claims tied directly to Caitlin Clark's value, influence, and legitimacy. This isn't just commentary anymore. It's a confrontation over how Caitlin Clark is perceived versus how Sheryl Swoopes interprets her impact. And as the rhetoric intensifies, the line between opinion and accusation disappears completely.
Of those thoughts being uninformed, she shoots like 60 shots a game, just being a little bit inflammatory and critical without any actual analysis. And she apologized for that during the women's college season, and she's now stepped in it again by saying that Indiana is in the playoffs right now without Caitlin Clark. By saying that like Katie Lou Samuelson's really more integral in terms of her two-way ability than Caitlin, and also saying that, and I don't besmirch her for this because
the tension around Sheryl Swoopes and Caitlin Clark builds from long-standing friction, but it explodes when claims about Caitlin Clark's shooting volume, efficiency, and playoff value are pushed into public debate. Every argument tied to Sheryl Swoopes becomes a referendum on how Caitlin Clark is evaluated in modern WNBA discourse. When Sheryl Swoopes suggests the Indiana Fever could still function without Caitlin Clark, the reaction isn't quiet, it becomes a flashpoint. Because the entire framing of Caitlin Clark's rookie impact is already tied to viewership spikes, team transformation, and offensive structure shifts. Removing Caitlin Clark from that equation doesn't just change a lineup, it changes the entire narrative of the league. The criticism aimed at Sheryl Swoopes intensifies because the logic being used is seen as inconsistent with how Caitlin Clark's performance is actually observed on the court. Every stat, every possession, every defensive adjustment made against Caitlin Clark is used as counterweight to the idea that her presence is optional. And as Caitlin Clark continues to attract defensive attention, media focus, and franchise dependency, the argument around Sheryl Swoopes shifts from basketball analysis into something deeper: credibility under pressure. The fallout spreads quickly across conversations because Caitlin Clark is not just a player in this debate, she is the measuring stick. And Sheryl Swoopes, once untouchable as a Hall of Famer, is now being evaluated through the lens of how she interprets the Caitlin Clark phenomenon.
Said on the Elle Duncan show about Sheryl Swoopes and her most recent hater behavior. Let's take a listen.
They're dominating, man.
That's crazy.
They're out here dominating. Now, someone did take a loss in the basketball world this week, though. Ooh. And I love her, but she's wrong here. Sheryl Swoopes, former WNBA player, we all know that, current host of Queen of the Court podcast.
Queen of the Court podcast, in case you guys don't know, is a podcast hosted by Sheryl Swoopes.
The center of the storm becomes Elle Duncan, who steps into the conversation involving Sheryl Swoopes and Caitlin Clark with a tone that challenges not just opinions, but patterns. The criticism aimed at Sheryl Swoopes focuses heavily on consistency, how statements about Caitlin Clark seem to shift depending on context, timing, and narrative framing. Within this breakdown, Caitlin Clark represents more than performance. She represents a stress test for media interpretation. Every time Sheryl Swoopes comments on Caitlin Clark, it triggers a reaction that questions whether analysis is being shaped by emotion or evidence. The discussion around Sheryl Swoopes also expands into her public persona as a former WNBA champion and current media voice. But the core issue keeps returning to Caitlin Clark and how her impact is being framed. Even neutral observations about Caitlin Clark become charged when filtered through the ongoing tension involving Sheryl Swoopes. Historically, basketball debates like this have always existed, but the Caitlin Clark effect amplifies everything. Comparisons are drawn to earlier eras where rookies reshaped leagues, but none operated under the same media intensity as Caitlin Clark. That intensity turns every statement about Sheryl Swoopes into a larger discussion about credibility, while Caitlin Clark remains the central reference point for both praise and criticism. The psychological layer is simple but powerful. Caitlin Clark forces clarity, and Sheryl Swoopes becomes part of a system trying to define that clarity in real time.
Still make the playoffs without Caitlin Clark. Now, folks, all we need to do is look back at last season to think and say,
the lie detector determined that was a lie.
And in the same breath, she says that Katie Lou Samuelson is one of the most valuable players, if not the most valuable player on the Indiana Fever and responsible for this turnaround this season. What is going on here?
As the debate escalates, Caitlin Clark becomes the undeniable anchor of Indiana Fever's transformation narrative. Every argument involving Sheryl Swoopes now circles back to one central question: what happens to the Fever without Caitlin Clark? This is where the franchise impact becomes unavoidable. The Indiana Fever's rise is repeatedly tied to Caitlin Clark, from offensive structure to fan engagement to national broadcast attention. Any claim minimizing Caitlin Clark immediately collides with visible changes in attendance, scoring flow, and team identity. The controversy surrounding Sheryl Swoopes intensifies because her evaluation of Caitlin Clark is seen as disconnected from this broader reality. In modern basketball economics, Caitlin Clark is not just a scorer, she is a system-altering presence. Removing her from Indiana's framework doesn't just weaken the roster, it reshapes the entire competitive identity. Meanwhile, Elle Duncan's reaction becomes symbolic of a larger media shift, where former narratives about Caitlin Clark are being challenged more openly. And in that challenge, Sheryl Swoopes becomes the focal point of disagreement between legacy perspective and modern interpretation. The stakes are no longer just about opinions. They are about how Caitlin Clark is historically recorded versus how Sheryl Swoopes chooses to interpret her present-day impact. That tension defines the climax of this media confrontation. At the center of this entire storm, Caitlin Clark remains the player everyone is trying to define, while Sheryl Swoopes becomes the voice under scrutiny for how that definition is shaped. And Elle Duncan steps into the conversation as the moment where silence ends and disagreement becomes public. Whether this is a clash of opinion or a correction of narrative depends entirely on how Caitlin Clark's impact is measured moving forward, and how Sheryl Swoopes continues to frame it. But one question now dominates everything. Is the backlash against Sheryl Swoopes about defending Caitlin Clark, or about finally confronting how media narratives around Caitlin Clark are built in the first place?